Since the earliest days, we have used waterways for transportation, commerce, and military purposes. And as long as vessels have sailed, there have been shipwrecks. There are literally thousands of wrecks in the Great Lakes from every period in history. Some live on in our memory for decades after their loss. Others pass into obscurity almost unnoticed, a 5-line story buried in the back of the newspaper. In the next few minutes, we'll look at one of these forgotten shipwrecks. The North Wind was built in 1888 by Globe Iron Works in Cleveland, Ohio. She was one of 6 sister ships built for the Northern Transportation Company. In 1917, she was converted from a package freighter to a bulk carrier and taken to the East Coast. In 1923, she was sold again and returned to the Great Lakes. On July 1, 1926, the North Wind was en route from Little Current, Ontario, located on Georgian Bay's North Channel, to Fort William, Ontario, on Lake Superior. What happened next is the subject of debate. The captain and crew maintained she ran aground on Robertson Rock near Clapperton Island. About 2 hours after the grounding, the North Wind slid off the shoal into deep water. All the crew was able to abandon ship and make their way back to Little Current. However, other reports cite perfect weather conditions and the lack of any physical damage to the hull of the wreck as evidence of possible insurance fraud. For our trip to the North Wind, I chose the Dawn Light, a live-aboard dive boat operating from Tobermory, Ontario. The Dawn Light proved to be the perfect choice for the trip. We enjoyed accommodations, food, dive support including air fills and custom gas mixing, and beautiful scenery all in one package. Departing from Tobermory, we headed north to the wreck site of the North Wind. Along the way, we passed through the town of Little Current, the origination point of the North Wind's final voyage. Upon reaching the wreck site, we wasted no time getting into the water. The wreck is impressive. She's mostly intact and lies within sport diving range. Since she sank stern first, she lies at an angle. The bow is 80 feet deep, while the stern, partially buried in the lake bottom, is at about 120 feet. The anchors still hang neatly in their hawse pipes. While on the forepeak, the windlass stands as mute sentinel. One can penetrate the forepeak as well. This area contains a small workshop. A grinding wheel sits on the workbench in the corner. Heading aft, we arrive at the forward cabin area where the pilot house once stood. The pilot house actually blew off completely intact during the sinking and washed up on Clapperton Island, where the lighthouse keeper was able to recover the ship's log, which hadn't even gotten wet. On the wreck, A tangled mass of debris is all that is left of the forward cabin area. The forward mast juts up out of the wreckage at a crazy angle. At the base of the mast, one can just make out the rim of a bathtub filled with silt and debris. Aft of the forward cabin area, we reach the spar deck. The hatch covers are gone, revealing empty cargo holds. Right behind the cabin area is the forward mooring winch, used to pull heavy mooring lines on board and snug the North Wind up against the dock when in port. About 2/3 down the spar deck, a spare propeller is chained to the deck. The stern of the wreck is the most intact. Descending on the roof of the aft cabin, we find a ventilator with red paint inside clearly visible. Continuing towards the rear of the ship, we pass by the aft mast, still standing. The skylight provides one way to access the engine room. Dropping through the skylight, we find ourselves on top of the North Wind's engine. Note the white paint still visible on the wood. A narrow ladder leads down to the bowels of the engine room. The first thing we see as we descend to the lowest level of the ship is the electrical panel. Visibility in the bottom of the engine room is usually marginal at best. There's almost always a rust-colored haze that hangs in the water. Our trip is early in the dive season, so we are the first divers on the wreck this year. No one has been in the engine room since last summer, and the water is gin clear. We see the wheel that turned the dynamo, which generated the ship's electricity. The leather belt that connected them is still there. Light bulbs, still enclosed in glass fixtures, hang from the ceiling. Looking through under the engine, we can just make out the connecting rods that turned the propeller shaft. We reach the forward bulkhead and must turn around. Here is the ship's dynamo. by the wheel that turned the dynamo again, getting a good view of the belt that connected it to the dynamo. We pass by the electrical panel again and proceed further aft. On the aft bulkhead hangs a mirror above a sink. A red sign warns that this water is for washing only, not for drinking. A doorway leads even further aft. Peeking inside, we see a workroom of sorts, with huge wrenches hanging in a rack. Swimming along the aft bulkhead, we find more interesting machinery and odds and ends. Returning to the upper level of the engine room, we explore an open door on the port side of the engine. It leads to a workshop. Inside, we find a workbench with a vise on it and another open door. This one leads to the boiler room. This is where the stokers would shovel coal into the massive boilers. There is a hallway on each side of the aft cabin. We are on the port side of the ship, swimming towards the rear. We plan to swim down the hallway to the rear of the cabin area, turn left and enter the crew's mess. The open door leads to the upper level of the engine room. Next to the door, a fire axe hangs on the wall. It is interesting to note that we see open portholes and doors everywhere on the ship. It seems the crew wasn't too concerned with damage control. Proceeding down the hallway towards the rear of the ship, we peek into silt-filled cabins. Straight ahead is a door that would lead out to the fantail of the ship if we could open it. Turning left, we enter the crew's mess. Another left turn takes us forward into the galley. The door to the walk-in freezer is open. We see some broken china next to the sink. Turning around, we see the stove, hot water tank, and freezer again. Returning to the crew's mess, we enter the hallway on the starboard side of the ship and make our way forward. On the left is a drinking fountain. The door leads into the top of the engine room. It mirrors the door we saw on the port side next to the fire axe. Making our way to the very stern of the ship, we find it half buried in the lake bottom. The tremendous force of the ship striking the bottom stern first pushed waves of clay up onto the fantail. No chance of seeing the prop or rudder on this wreck. All too soon, it's time to return to the surface. Since the wreck isn't terribly deep and we're breathing nitrox, our decompression is short. Our deco stops are also quite comfortable since Captain Davis has deployed a multi-level deco platform complete with surface-supplied oxygen. Almost before we know it, it's time to head back to Tobermory. We enjoy the beautiful trip and dive a few more wrecks along the way. There's probably no way to know for sure what happened to the North Wind. Did she really run aground, or was she scuttled for the insurance money? The lack of damage to the bow or forward part of the hull and the open portholes seem to point towards something sinister. Or perhaps it just makes for a good story. There are still areas of the North Wind we haven't explored, so we eagerly await our return trip next year.